Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had been in the Army for 12 years, earning every stripe through blood, sweat, and an unwavering dedication to her soldiers. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, led countless training exercises, and never lost a single person under her command. Her platoon respected her more than any officer they'd ever encountered, and for good reason. Maria knew each of her 32 soldiers personally, their strengths, weaknesses, fears, and dreams. She'd stayed up all night with Private Johnson when his wife filed for divorce, helped Corporal Williams study for his promotion exam, and personally mentored every new recruit that came through their unit at Fort Braxton. When Captain Stevens announced his retirement, everyone assumed Maria would take over as acting platoon leader. She had the experience, the respect, and the tactical knowledge that surpassed most officers half her age. The soldiers had already begun looking to her for guidance even before the official announcement. But when the orders came down from Colonel Harrison, Maria felt her world shift beneath her feet. The command was being given to Second Lieutenant Bradley Matthews, a 24-year-old fresh out of West Point who'd never seen combat and had been at the base for exactly 6 weeks. Lieutenant Matthews was everything Maria wasn't: privileged, connected, and utterly unprepared for the responsibility of leading battle-hardened soldiers. His father was a retired general, his grandfather had been a Pentagon advisor, and his family name carried weight in military circles. During their first meeting, Matthews barely made eye contact with Maria, instead focusing on his phone and making dismissive comments about maintaining proper chain of command. When she tried to brief him on the platoon's current training schedule and individual soldier assessments, he waved her off, saying he'd figure it out as he went along. The soldiers noticed the change immediately. Matthew's first formation was a disaster. He forgot half the protocols, mispronounced names, and issued contradictory orders. When Private Chen asked about their upcoming field exercise, Matthews snapped at him for questioning authority. Maria watched from the sidelines, her jaw clenched as she saw the confusion and frustration in her soldiers' eyes. These were men and women who trusted her with their lives, and now they were being led by someone who treated them like inconveniences. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Matthews made increasingly poor decisions, from scheduling conflicting training exercises to ignoring intelligence reports that Maria had carefully prepared. He refused to listen to her input, often cutting her off mid-sentence during briefings. The final straw came during a tactical exercise when Matthews' incompetence nearly resulted in a training accident. A live-fire drill had been improperly coordinated, and only Maria's quick intervention prevented serious injury to 3 soldiers. That night, Maria sat in her quarters, staring at the resignation letter she'd been writing and rewriting for days. She'd given her life to the Army, but watching her soldiers suffer under incompetent leadership was breaking her heart. She thought about all the young men and women who looked up to her, who needed her guidance and protection. Tomorrow would bring another day of watching Matthews endanger the people she'd sworn to protect. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had been in the Army for 12 years, earning every stripe through blood, sweat, and an unwavering dedication to her soldiers. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, led countless training exercises, and never lost a single person under her command. Her platoon respected her more than any officer they'd ever encountered, and for good reason. Maria knew each of her 32 soldiers personally, their strengths, weaknesses, fears, and dreams. She'd stayed up all night with Private Johnson when his wife filed for divorce, helped Corporal Williams study for his promotion exam, and personally mentored every new recruit that came through their unit at Fort Braxton. When Captain Stevens announced his retirement, everyone assumed Maria would take over as acting platoon leader. She had the experience, the respect, and the tactical knowledge that surpassed most officers half her age. The soldiers had already begun looking to her for guidance even before the official announcement. But when the orders came down from Colonel Harrison, Maria felt her world shift beneath her feet. The command was being given to Second Lieutenant Bradley Matthews, a 24-year-old fresh out of West Point who'd never seen combat and had been at the base for exactly 6 weeks. Lieutenant Matthews was everything Maria wasn't: privileged, connected, and utterly unprepared for the responsibility of leading battle-hardened soldiers. His father was a retired general, his grandfather had been a Pentagon advisor, and his family name carried weight in military circles. During their first meeting, Matthews barely made eye contact with Maria, instead focusing on his phone and making dismissive comments about maintaining proper chain of command. When she tried to brief him on the platoon's current training schedule and individual soldier assessments, he waved her off, saying he'd figure it out as he went along. The soldiers noticed the change immediately. Matthew's first formation was a disaster. He forgot half the protocols, mispronounced names, and issued contradictory orders. When Private Chen asked about their upcoming field exercise, Matthews snapped at him for questioning authority. Maria watched from the sidelines, her jaw clenched as she saw the confusion and frustration in her soldiers' eyes. These were men and women who trusted her with their lives, and now they were being led by someone who treated them like inconveniences. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Matthews made increasingly poor decisions, from scheduling conflicting training exercises to ignoring intelligence reports that Maria had carefully prepared. He refused to listen to her input, often cutting her off mid-sentence during briefings. The final straw came during a tactical exercise when Matthews' incompetence nearly resulted in a training accident. A live fire drill had been improperly coordinated, and only Maria's quick intervention prevented serious injury to 3 soldiers. That night, Maria sat in her quarters, staring at the resignation letter she'd been writing and rewriting for days. She'd given her life to the army, but watching her soldiers suffer under incompetent leadership was breaking her heart. She thought about all the young men and women who looked up to her, who needed her guidance and protection. Tomorrow would bring another day of watching Matthews endanger the people she'd sworn to protect. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Maria's quarters. Sergeant First Class David Thompson, her second-in-command and closest friend in the unit, knocked on her door with an urgent expression. Behind him stood 5 other senior non-commissioned officers, all looking determined and slightly nervous. David didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk, Maria. The soldiers are planning something, and honestly, we're all behind them." He explained that the enlisted personnel had been meeting in secret, discussing their complete loss of confidence in Lieutenant Matthews. What started as grumbling had evolved into something more serious. The previous day's near accident had been the catalyst. Word had spread quickly through the barracks about how Matthews had ignored safety protocols and how only Maria's intervention had prevented casualties. The soldiers had reached a breaking point. They'd watched their respected sergeant be sidelined, ignored, and disrespected by someone they viewed as dangerously incompetent. "They're talking about refusing to follow orders," David continued, his voice low. "Not exactly mutiny, but close enough to end careers. They want you to know that they're willing to risk everything because they believe in you." Maria felt a mixture of pride and terror. She understood the gravity of what her soldiers were considering. Military discipline was absolute, and any form of organized resistance could result in court-martial for everyone involved. But she also understood their desperation. They were being asked to trust their lives to someone who had proven himself untrustworthy. The situation was unprecedented in her experience, but the loyalty her soldiers were showing her was both humbling and heartbreaking. Over the next few hours, Maria found herself in a series of intense, whispered conversations with soldiers throughout the base. They sought her out individually, each expressing their frustration and their willingness to take a stand. Private Johnson, the young man she'd helped through his divorce, found her in the mess hall. "Sergeant Rodriguez, we've been talking. We can't do this anymore. We need real leadership, not someone who's going to get us killed." His words were echoed by soldier after soldier throughout the day. The situation came to a head during the afternoon formation. Lieutenant Matthews had called the platoon together to announce new training protocols, but his presentation was, as usual, disorganized and confusing. He contradicted himself multiple times, gave incorrect information about safety procedures, and became increasingly agitated when soldiers asked for clarification. Maria watched from her position at the back of the formation, seeing the mounting frustration in her soldiers' faces. When Matthews finally dismissed the formation, the soldiers didn't disperse as usual. Instead, they remained in place, looking at each other with a mix of determination and apprehension. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward, his voice carrying across the formation area. "Sir, the enlisted personnel of this platoon have lost confidence in your leadership. We formally request that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez be restored to her rightful position as platoon leader." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Matthew's face turned red with rage and embarrassment. "You can't do this. I'm in command here." But even as he spoke, it was clear that his authority had evaporated. The soldiers stood firm, their eyes fixed on Maria, waiting for her response to this unprecedented act of military rebellion. Lieutenant Matthews stormed off to find Colonel Harrison, leaving the platoon standing in formation. Maria knew that within hours, the entire base would know about this confrontation. Military gossip traveled faster than official communications, and something like this would reach the highest levels of command quickly. She also knew that her soldiers had just risked their careers for her. The weight of their trust and loyalty was almost overwhelming, but she also felt a surge of pride in their courage and conviction. The next few hours were a blur of emergency meetings, angry phone calls, and tense conversations. Colonel Harrison summoned Maria to his office, where Lieutenant Matthews sat looking both furious and somewhat defeated. The colonel, a career military man in his 50s, looked exhausted by the situation. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm going to be frank with you. This is a disaster. I've got 32 soldiers refusing to follow orders, a lieutenant who's lost all credibility, and a staff sergeant who's somehow become the center of a mutiny. What am I supposed to do with this?" Maria chose her words carefully. "Sir, with respect, this isn't a mutiny. These soldiers aren't refusing to serve their country or follow military law. They're expressing a legitimate concern about leadership that they believe puts their lives at risk. They've seen Lieutenant Matthews' performance, and they've lost confidence in his ability to lead them effectively. They're not asking to choose their own officers. They're asking for competent leadership." Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment. "And what's your role in all this, Sergeant? Are you encouraging this rebellion?" Maria met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. I've dedicated my career to military discipline and proper chain of command. But I also have a responsibility to these soldiers. They've served honorably, and they deserve leaders who will protect them, not endanger them. They made this decision on their own, based on their own observations and experiences." The colonel turned to Lieutenant Matthews, who had been sitting silently throughout the conversation. "Lieutenant, what's your assessment of the situation?" Matthews' response was petulant and defensive. "These soldiers are insubordinate, sir. They need to be reminded of their place. This is exactly what happens when you let enlisted personnel get too comfortable with their superiors. Sergeant Rodriguez has obviously been undermining my authority since day one." Maria felt her temper flare but maintained her composure. "Sir, if I may, Lieutenant Matthews is incorrect. I've followed proper protocol throughout his command. I've attempted to brief him on platoon operations, offered assistance with training schedules, and provided intelligence reports. My interactions with the soldiers have been professional and within the bounds of my responsibilities as their staff sergeant. The soldiers' loss of confidence stems from Lieutenant Matthews' own actions and decisions." The meeting continued for another hour, with Colonel Harrison asking detailed questions about specific incidents and decisions. It became clear that the colonel had already been receiving reports about Matthew's poor performance, but had hoped the situation would improve with time. The formal complaint from the entire platoon had forced his hand. Finally, he dismissed both Maria and Matthews, saying he needed time to consider his options and consult with higher command. That evening, Maria found herself surrounded by her soldiers in the recreation center. They'd heard about the meeting with the colonel, and tension was high. The soldiers were committed to their course of action, but they also understood the potential consequences. Court-martial proceedings, dishonorable discharge, and the end of military careers were all possibilities. Yet not one of them expressed regret about their decision. "We'd rather face punishment than face combat under incompetent leadership," Corporal Williams said, speaking for the group. The next morning brought unexpected news. Colonel Harrison had received a call from the Pentagon, where news of the situation had somehow reached high-ranking officials. The Army was dealing with multiple scandals involving leadership failures, and the last thing they needed was a public relations disaster involving an entire platoon refusing to follow orders. More importantly, someone had been asking questions about Lieutenant Matthews' rapid promotion and his family connections. Maria was called to the colonel's office again, this time alone. Harrison looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm going to be completely honest with you. This situation is bigger than just our base now. There are people in Washington who are very interested in what's happening here. I've been ordered to conduct a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding Lieutenant Matthews' assignment and his performance since arriving at Fort Braxton." He continued, "I've also been strongly advised to find an immediate solution to the leadership crisis in your platoon. These soldiers have training exercises scheduled, and they need to be led by someone they trust. I'm prepared to make some changes, but I need to know that you're willing to step up and take responsibility for getting this unit back on track." Maria felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "Sir, I'm ready to serve in whatever capacity you deem appropriate. These soldiers deserve strong leadership, and I'm prepared to provide it. But I also want to make sure that this situation doesn't result in punishment for the soldiers who stood up for what they believed was right." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "I understand your concern for your soldiers, Sergeant. That's exactly the kind of leadership they need. Here's what's going to happen. Lieutenant Matthews is being reassigned to a staff position pending the completion of the investigation. You're being given temporary command of the platoon, effective immediately. If the investigation supports what I already suspect, this assignment will become permanent, and you'll be recommended for promotion to Sergeant First Class. The news hit Maria like a physical blow. After weeks of frustration and watching her soldiers struggle under poor leadership, vindication felt almost surreal. But Harrison wasn't finished. There's more. The soldiers who participated in yesterday's demonstration will not face disciplinary action. The investigation has already revealed enough concerns about Lieutenant Matthews' performance to justify their loss of confidence. In fact, their willingness to risk their careers rather than accept dangerous leadership is being viewed as an example of moral courage. As Maria left the colonel's office, she felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. It was a weight she'd been prepared to carry for years, but having it officially recognized felt different. She walked across the base toward the platoon's barracks, where she knew her soldiers would be waiting for news. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parade ground, and she could see soldiers moving about their duties with the precision and dedication that had made her proud to serve alongside them. When she entered the barracks, conversation stopped abruptly. 32 pairs of eyes turned toward her, searching her face for any indication of what had transpired in the colonel's office. Maria looked at each of them, these soldiers who had risked everything for her, and felt a profound sense of responsibility and gratitude. "Listen up," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came naturally to her. "I have some news." The silence was absolute as Maria explained the colonel's decision. Lieutenant Matthews was being reassigned. The investigation was underway, and she was assuming command of the platoon. But more importantly, none of the soldiers would face disciplinary action for their unprecedented stand. As the news sank in, Maria watched relief and pride wash over their faces. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were her soldiers, and she was their leader. Sergeant First Class Thompson stepped forward, his face showing a mix of relief and satisfaction. "What are your orders, Sergeant Rodriguez?" The question was formal, but Maria could hear the genuine respect and affection in his voice. She looked around the barracks at faces she'd known for years, soldiers she'd trained, mentored, and fought alongside. "First order of business. We're going to show this base what a properly led platoon looks like. We've got training exercises coming up, and we're going to execute them flawlessly. But more than that, we're going to take care of each other the way we always have." The next few weeks were transformative for the platoon. Under Maria's leadership, they threw themselves into training with renewed enthusiasm and precision. Word of their situation had spread throughout the base, and other units watched with interest as they demonstrated the kind of cohesion and effectiveness that comes from mutual respect and competent leadership. Maria restructured their training schedule, incorporated lessons from her combat experience, and ensured that every soldier understood not just what they were doing, but why they were doing it. The investigation into Lieutenant Matthews' assignment and performance moved quickly once higher command became involved. It revealed a pattern of preferential treatment, ignored warning signs, and family influence that had resulted in his placement in a position for which he was woefully unprepared. The report was scathing in its criticism of the assignment process and recommended significant changes to prevent similar situations in the future. More importantly for Maria and her soldiers, the investigation validated every concern they had raised about Matthew's leadership. His inability to follow basic safety protocols, his dismissive attitude toward experienced non-commissioned officers, and his general incompetence were all documented and confirmed. The investigators interviewed every soldier in the platoon, and their testimonies painted a clear picture of dangerous leadership and the courage it took to stand up against it. 3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Maria stood before her platoon wearing the chevrons of a sergeant first class. The promotion ceremony was attended by Colonel Harrison, visiting dignitaries from the Pentagon, and soldiers from throughout the base. In his speech, the colonel praised the platoon's moral courage and highlighted their situation as an example of why the Army needed to value experience and competence over connections and privilege. But for Maria, the real victory wasn't in the promotion or the recognition. It was in the faces of her soldiers, who had learned that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, could lead to positive change. They had risked their careers for her, and she had proven worthy of their trust. The platoon had become stronger, more cohesive, and more effective than ever before. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Private Johnson approached Maria with a smile. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for today, but for everything. You taught us that leadership isn't about rank or connections. It's about taking care of your people and doing what's right." His words were echoed by soldier after soldier as they congratulated their newly promoted leader. That evening, Maria sat in her quarters, now larger and more comfortable befitting her new rank. But her thoughts weren't on the physical changes. She was thinking about the letter of resignation she'd been writing weeks earlier, the one that would have ended her military career and left her soldiers without the leader they deserved. She was grateful she'd never sent it, grateful for soldiers who had been willing to risk everything for her, and grateful for a system that, despite its flaws, had ultimately done the right thing. The story of Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez and her platoon became something of a legend at Fort Braxton and beyond. It was told in leadership courses as an example of moral courage, discussed in Pentagon briefings as a case study in the importance of merit-based assignments, and remembered by soldiers who understood that sometimes doing the right thing requires taking risks. But for Maria, the most important outcome wasn't the recognition or the career advancement. It was the knowledge that she had lived up to the trust her soldiers had placed in her, that she had proven worthy of their loyalty, and that together they had demonstrated that competent, caring leadership could overcome institutional obstacles and create positive change. Lieutenant Matthews was quietly reassigned to a desk job and eventually left the Army. His family connections couldn't overcome the documented evidence of his failures, and the investigation had exposed the preferential treatment he'd received. He became a cautionary tale about the dangers of promoting people based on connections rather than competence. Years later, many of the soldiers who had stood up for Maria went on to become leaders themselves, carrying with them the lessons they'd learned about courage, loyalty, and the importance of standing up for what's right. They understood that true leadership wasn't about rank or privilege. It was about earning the trust and respect of those you serve with, and being willing to put their welfare above your own ambitions. Maria continued to serve with distinction, eventually retiring as a command sergeant major after a career that spanned 2 decades. She never forgot the soldiers who had risked everything for her, and she never stopped believing that the Army was at its best when it valued competence, character, and courage over connections and privilege. The Platoon story became a reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against external enemies, but against the internal forces that threaten to undermine the values and principles that make military service meaningful. It was a story about soldiers who refused to accept incompetent leadership, about a leader who proved worthy of their trust, and about a system that, when pushed to do the right thing, could still live up to its highest ideals. In the end, the title, the Army Sergeant, was denied command, until the platoon refused to march without her, became more than just a description of events. It became a symbol of the power of moral courage, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the truth that real leadership isn't about rank or connections. It's about earning the trust and respect of those you serve with, and being willing to sacrifice for their welfare. The story of Maria Rodriguez and her soldiers proved that sometimes the most important victories are won not on distant battlefields, but in the daily struggle to maintain the values and principles that make military service a noble calling. It was a reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest act of bravery is simply standing up and saying, "This is wrong, and we won't accept it." And in the end, that's exactly what they did. They stood up, they refused to accept incompetent leadership, and they proved that when soldiers and leaders work together based on mutual respect and shared values, they can overcome any obstacle and achieve any goal. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, and a story that would inspire others to find the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. The legacy of their actions extended far beyond their individual careers. Policy changes were implemented to prevent similar situations. Leadership training was enhanced to emphasize the importance of competence over connections, and the Army became more responsive to concerns about leadership effectiveness. Their courage had created positive change that would benefit soldiers for generations to come. Maria Rodriguez had finally received the command she'd always deserved, but more importantly, she had earned it through the respect and loyalty of her soldiers. They had refused to march without her, and in doing so, they had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a soldier's arsenal isn't a rifle or a grenade. It's the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. The platoon continued to serve with distinction under Maria's leadership, becoming one of the most effective units on the base. They had learned valuable lessons about leadership, loyalty, and moral courage that would serve them well throughout their military careers and beyond. But most importantly, they had learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't about defeating an enemy. It's about standing up for your principles and proving that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, can create positive change that lasts for generations. Their story became a testament to the power of moral courage and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the personal cost is high. It was a reminder that true leadership isn't about rank or privilege. It's about earning the trust and respect of those you serve with, and being willing to sacrifice for their welfare. And in the end, that's exactly what Maria Rodriguez and her soldiers did. They stood up for what was right, and they proved that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with courage, conviction, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right. The Army sergeant had been denied command, but when her platoon refused to march without her, she finally received the recognition and responsibility she had always deserved. It was a victory not just for Maria Rodriguez, but for every soldier who had ever stood up for what's right, and a reminder that courage and conviction can overcome any obstacle when people are willing to stand together and fight for what they believe in.